This is Dialogue. Dialogue, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
This is Dialogue Assassination with political research specialist Mae Brussell. I'm Phil Kogan. Is that in the background there, Mae? Are you saying something?
Yeah, I'm mumbling.
You're mumbling.
I'm trying to remember my name.
Dialogue Assassination is a program that examines the political implications of political assassinations and the relationship of those assassinations to everyday events in the news which go sometimes unnoticed or unconnected, right, Mae?
That's right. They go unnoticed and unconnected. And speaking of that, I'm going to read the news coverage of a very important trial that's going on in our area right now and show you how the local news carries it, and then tell you that the outlying areas like the San Jose Mercury and the San Francisco Chronicle haven't touched this case at all yet. And I'm going to try to calm down, Phil. I've been very upset. I'm going to talk about the trial of Hugo Pinnell that is taking place this week and the past week in Monterey County in California. And I'm going to give you the background of Hugo Pinnell. I did about 20 minutes of our show last week about Hugo. This week I attended the trials myself, and I'm going to let Hugo speak for himself. I'm going to read you some of the notes that I took that he said on the stand and go into the background of this particular man. The reason I'm discussing him is that my research goes into political assassinations, and going along with the word assassination is the word conspiracy. They're equal because there were conspiracies that killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the Oda family, and the Sharon Tate massacre, the LaBiancas, in Los Angeles. Lee Harvey Oswald, James Ray, Sirhan Sirhan, Charles Manson, John Frazier, and Hugo Pinnell did not kill the persons that they were on trial for killing. They are innocent, and they are victims of a conspiracy for purposes that we go into many times on the various figures. I place now Hugo Pinnell in the category of a political conspiracy. I've heard him tell on the stand for just 2 days why there is a conspiracy to get him and to hurt him and eventually to kill him and to set him up as an example for all the black inmates in the California penal system. Hugo Pinnell's case is identical to the prosecution of James Ray or Sirhan or Manson or Frazier. I'm going to go into the position, not of all those cases. I'm going to talk about his judge, the prosecution, the public defender. In this case, the evidence is destroyed or missing that would help prove his innocence. He can't choose his own lawyer. Ruby could not use Mr. Howard for a lawyer. He was forced to have Belli and Joe Tannehill. Oswald had no lawyer. He was killed. Sirhan could not use Godfrey Isaac. Now he has to stick with McKissick, and he had Grant Cooper. James Ray had Mr. Hines representing him till the hour of the trial, saying that it was a conspiracy. 24 hours before going to court, he got Percy Foreman put onto the case. Hugo Pinnell does not have a lawyer. He's in court today. He does not even have a lawyer representing him. His life is on the line. Identical to the major political assassinations, the witnesses that would prove his innocence are not allowed to be called by the public defender. He's been accused by the defense as being part of the conspiracy. I accused the man myself. He called KLRB. The public defender's office called here. The position I'm taking on Hugo Pinnell and on all these assassinations has nothing to do with the news department or the policy of KLRB. I am a researcher. I back up my work with documentation. I stand alone. They do not send me there to cover the story at all. I went of my own free will because it is a conspiratorial case that fits in with the entire state of California. The witnesses that would defend and prove the innocence of Hugo Pinel have been killed, missing, threatened to be killed. They're brutalized. Some are in the strip cells now and have been there for 9 days. They're told they'll get a lifetime in jail. They're offered parole to turn on him. We'll go into the planted evidence, envelopes with prints of Pinel, just like in the major political assassinations, evidence withheld, evidence missing, witnesses missing.
Now, those are kind of some heavy charges to make.
Yes. I'll go into them as time allows, one by one, and show you just what I mean in those charges. This last Wednesday night, I sent a night letter. It was dated April 19th, and it was sent to the following people: President Richard Nixon, the White House; Robert Kastenmeier, Subcommittee Number 3, Committee of the Judiciary, House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. Robert Kastenmeier was in California in October for a congressional investigation with members of Congress of the California penal system, at which time Mr. Pecunier, who's in charge of Department of Corrections, appeared and left. He didn't hear any of the testimony earlier or after he was there, and I'm going to read you a letter that Robert Kastenmeier wrote to Pecunier that he was worried that Mr. Hugo Pinel was going to be killed in the California penal system. I'm going to read that on the air because when he got back to Washington, he was afraid that Pinel would be killed in the custody of our system. And the man that he wrote it to, Mr. Pecunier, sat and witnessed Pinel chained to a chair, beaten up, his head broken open and badgered in the presence of the Attorney General of California and the head of the Corrections Department.
When did that take place?
Yesterday. I'll read. It happened up at San Quentin, and I'll read you what happened there. But I sent these telegrams. These telegrams. I'm reading the names to Robert Kastenmeier, who has sent a letter, and I'll read a copy of that on this program, worried about the life of Hugo Pinel. I sent the same telegram to Representative Conyers from Michigan, the House of Representatives, Alan Cerroti in the Assembly in California, who attended those congressional hearings from early morning to late at night, never leaving and taking in what was said, Frank Murphy, Assemblyman of California, who is now working for the Ombudsman bill in the state of California, so that he knows what's happening down here. Robert Dellums, House of Representatives, Washington. Don Edwards, House of Representatives, Washington. Shirley Chisholm, House of Representatives. Bella Abzug, House of Representatives. Senator Fred Harris, Washington, D.C. Jonathan Bingham, House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. and John Tunney, Senator from Washington, D.C. I will send a letter to every member of Congress to the effect of what is in this telegram, but because I don't have that much money, and it was a lengthy telegram, I'm going to read. This went out last night, including the White House. It read as follows. Defendant Hugo Pinel, Court of Judge Machado, Salinas, California, is being denied all legal and human rights. California Department of Corrections, Attorney General Evel Younger must be thoroughly, immediately investigated by Congress. Conspiracy of judge, public defender, California justice system, personified in this case. I'll take off the letter for 1 minute. The Congress knows that these men that I talk about are involved in the Manson and the Frazier and the Sirhan case. But this is an easy case because it's only going 2 weeks and it isn't complicated. And everything I've said about those gentlemen is personified in this particular case. It's easy to get the picture here. The wire goes on. Pinel and Raymond Marquez, inmates at Soledad, are in immediate danger of death or damage for life. They are brutalized daily. Pinel's trial, a mockery of justice. Pinel denied proof of innocence. Key evidence missing. Defense witnesses not allowed. Strip cells, brutalization, bribery, death threats to inmates who would testify. Please act. Transcript of this trial will document these charges. Urgent. Signed, Mae Brussell. Now, I stand by that the transcript of just what I saw will document everything that I've said on this show about the other political assassinations and what I charged in this letter. So the charges I said that are heavy, Phil, all you have to do is get the transcript of this particular trial. Now, I want to, I was going to read a poem called The Hangman. I think I'll go right to the Pinel case, and if we have time when it's over, I'm going to read it to you. I read it at the Human Rights Day out at the college this year. It's written by a man who once did serve time in prison. And it's the story of people sitting by and doing nothing and watching the other person being taken away until you're the last one left, and then you realize that you were intended to be part of the group, that you could tolerate violence and killing done to another person as long as it didn't affect your life. But then when it came your turn, you couldn't take it, and you're left alone, and you still meet the same fate. And the reason I want to read this, if we have time, is that yesterday when Mr. Pinnell was chained around the neck and shoulders and his arms handcuffed and his legs a few inches apart with chains, and he's knocked down along with Raymond Marquez, another man, in the courtroom, and 40 sheriffs from Monterey County are over these men, and they're screaming and yelling, and we didn't know if they were dead or alive, and they're being badgered in front of the people in the court. And Mrs. Hugo Pinnell's mother screaming and crying, and no one can see these men. We saw the hair of Marquez pulled out by a handful and brutalized right in front of us, and a huge overfill of armed men with these two chained men lying on the ground screaming, and they're standing over them, and it was a terrifying experience. And Hugo's mother is crying to the people. They made us leave the court. I didn't want to leave. I said, if you're going to kill him, I want to see you kill him. Right here, they've been threatening it ever since he's been in the California Department of Corrections.
Who's been threatening it?
The guards and everybody. The day before, Tuesday, Pinnell could hardly testify. He was in such pain, and the nerves of his teeth are exposed raw. He could hardly talk, and he passed out while we were having lunch. He was on the floor, passed out. When he wakes up, they say, die, dog, die. The guards say, you'll never make it out alive. I'll give you the names of the guards. We talked about this last week. They threaten him every minute, and I'm going to use his words so that you'll understand how the thing comes across. And his mother is yelling, wait till it's your turn, wait till it's your turn, she's saying to the people out in the foyer that are milling around. You don't know whether to vomit or cry, and you're absolutely in a state of shock. No one can talk to anybody else. And she's screaming, wait till it's your turn someday. And I kept thinking of the hangman. And I sat next to her, and I was glad that my life is dedicated to believing that these things happen and being able, I don't want to see them, but to be spending 9 years talking about this system and trying to tell you people out there what's happening. And it's happening just a few miles from your home in Salinas. I talk about fascism or Goering or Goebbels last week, or the Hitler setup that's in our state, and it's happening right out in your backyard, and it's hard to visualize. 3 people who I met through this radio show who began reading books on the political assassinations and collecting tapes of all the shows went out to the trial yesterday. And I was going to bring them in, Phil, this morning, but they're out there again today. And these 2 of the boys just were discharged from Fort Ord, and one lives in town, has worked here. And they were supposed to come over last night, and one of them was sick, had a headache, and they were so upset. These are establishment boys somewhat who just want to learn about the system. They've been listening to Dialogue Assassination for months now and saw this trial, and it was a flash of everything I said in every book they've read. The Garrison book, The Heritage of Stone, or all the books on the assassination that I've talked about was exemplified in a session out there in court.
Oh, let's get into that.
Okay. Now, to compare it to the other murders, I brought in a book that I have talked about on other shows that came out just recently by John Siegenthaler called A Search for Justice. 3 writers from Tennessee, newspapermen, carried the trial of James Ray, Clay Shaw, and Sirhan, and individually wrote a book on these particular trials and came to the conclusion that the American system of justice in these major criminal trials just doesn't work at all, and that if the American system of justice is like this at the lower courts, it will completely fall apart into chaos. There's no hope for the system as it exists. So to talk about it in generalities is one thing, to get onto the trial is another. Their book was dedicated to the memory of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy, who sought justice and died in the pursuit of it. My visiting at the trial of Hugo Pinnell, and I'll take this to a national level as quickly as I can because it's been so hushed up and he's been so brutalized, is in memory of those that search for justice too, and he has to go among them. A few quotations from this book that are pertinent to the Pinnell trial. These men covered the 3 trials, and I'm going to read you a few sentences I marked that pertain to Hugo Pinnell, because he is in the category of the political assassins they're talking about. The authors of this book said the possible dishonesty of the judges and attorneys never came up during the trial of Shaw, Ray, or Sirhan. He said there was a feeling on the part of all three reporters in those major cases that the question of judicial competence was a problem. Now I'm saying these men are writing about the trials of Ray, Sirhan, and Clay Shaw. I'm telling you that they're identical to Hugo Pinel. The judge, the book goes on to say, and to a greater degree the prosecutor have partial control of the destiny of the defendants, and it's obvious that the political process must occasionally tempt those who preside and those who prosecute. And it is not healthy to leave a defendant's case, particularly in sensational cases where community emotions may be high, in the hands of a district attorney or a judge, where they have an election coming up or they play politics in the state. The district attorney of Monterey County's name is Mr. Curtis, and you better get to know him. We'll be mentioning him a lot. And I know they're listening to this show today because all of them wondered why I was taking notes. I took 35 pages of notes one day, 29 the other day. They won't let you take a tape recorder in, and the reasons are perfectly obvious. The book goes on to say a system that has no provision for requiring judges and district attorneys to know what their business about is no system at all, and the federal system of selecting judges calls for an extensive background and investigation by the FBI. But in this other system, this isn't a federal court. It doesn't exist. It says the public has a right to expect that a workable system of justice will provide magistrates and prosecutors who are, at the very least, qualified to perform their duties in court, and this system makes no attempt to meet the public expectation. And there should be a method of investigating, when justified, censuring or disciplining the prosecutor or the defense lawyers or the judges who during the course of this trial engage in actions that undermine justice. And I'm going to take that quotation and I'm going to send that to every member of Congress in a letter because I can't afford them a telegram. And they're going to get a transcript of this trial, and that Congress is going to censure this particular state criminal system as it exists. If they don't want to go into the Manson or the Frazier or the Sirhan case, they can start with this. I'll let them start with this one. And censure the public defender and the prosecutor and the judge. I have witnessed them. And what they said is on record for history. I wrote a play on called The Tiger by the Tail that someday I had a chance to do it on Broadway, and then the man went to Europe to produce a movie on Hemingway, and he has not returned. It's a story of Earl Warren and Jack Ruby, the first act, using their words, and the second act is a polygraph test of Ruby writing his own questions with Henry Wade and District Attorney Alexander down in Dallas. And someday I would like to do a play on Hugo Pinel, just using the testimony of a 2-week trial. The book on the search for justice says the idea that local lawyers or the Bar Association will adequately investigate or properly discipline their judges or district attorneys or their defense lawyers is ludicrous. The local bar members want to get along with their presiding judge and the prosecuting attorney and their fellow lawyers, and they don't want trouble, and they do not want to damage the image of their profession by calling attention to the faults of those who work at the court. Everything here is applicable to the Pinel trial. The book goes on. The lawyer's theory is simply that if any one of these incidents interfere with the administration of criminal justice, the defendant has a right to appeal. The idea that justice or the public interest or the interest of the defendant is served by appeal is fallacious. Now, I'm stopping that quotation. The judge keeps saying, I want you to say everything so that you won't be able to say later that we didn't let you say it, or you'll have the right to appeal, and you'll have the right to appeal, and the public record will show you. He keeps saying to Pinel, you'll have the appeal. Pinel says, I want this case now. They have the witnesses to prove his innocence. He doesn't want an appeal. If he goes back to Soledad, he'll be dead. They told him he'd be dead. He doesn't want an appeal. He wants to get those chains off of his body now. He wants his teeth fixed. He can only use one side of his mouth. His teeth were knocked out, and he was sent to a dentist at Soledad. And he had to have the tooth. The tooth was completely splintered, and he had to have it fixed. And the dentist got orders from the office, you can't use Novocaine. and they wouldn't let him have anything to kill the pain. And the attendant, the prisoner who attends in the dental room, would not stay and watch. He walked out, and he got a slip, I think it's 115 or a reprimand, because he wouldn't watch. And the dentist took a pair of pliers and pulled his tooth out without an anesthetic or dental instrument. When he asked for the dental records for his court trial to show the conspiracy against him, and he has 30 reasons to show why they were trying to break him down, they've told him why. He can't have those at court, and the public defender won't ask for them. But this man...
how's this, like the charge about the dentist? Is that documented?
Oh, yes, of course, and he can't even talk. He can't use one side of his mouth. He's got raw nerves. And then...
What's the prison explanation for that?
The prison, I told you last week, and I've said it many times, the California prison system is like Auschwitz. What reason did Himmler have for doing what he did? You have to get the people across this coast from nation to nation, across this nation and to other places, to understand what's happening in Monterey County and Salinas in California.
But surely that charge, just the statement about the teeth, must have been answered by somebody.
Well, you know, at the time that
it was brought up, was it not challenged?
Not at all. He has no public defender. Yet, when the court went out of session yesterday, the public defender got up and said he's not taking the case anymore. The jury was out of the room, and Pindell didn't want him as his defender, and the defender said, I'm not taking the case anymore. And then the judge just calls the jury in and doesn't know to this day that Pindell doesn't have a public defender, so that whatever Pindell says isn't challenged or crossed. He's not defended by him, but the jury doesn't know it. They're out of the room when this is decided. So he's sitting there even without a defender. When he talks about his teeth...
Well, he has somebody assigned to the case.
No, not yesterday. No one. They took him off the stand.
He was there by himself?
Yeah, and they took him off the... I'll get to the point of what he was saying when he was on the stand, Phil. And they took him off the stand. And I'm going to go into a power blackout that happened in the court so that they could have a huddle with Sacramento. And I'm going to show you what he was saying. And at the time he said it, the lights went out. And I called the electric company in Salinas to see if the city had a blackout, and it was only in that courtroom. At 11:15, we were supposed to go till 12 and take a break till 1:30. And at 11:15, that room went black. And all the leniency that Pindell had to tell these stories was over. And when we came back at 1:30, he was no longer allowed to admit in evidence any more proof of a conspiracy against him, because he had named Evel Younger for CUNY of the Department of Corrections and this whole corrections system in the state of California. The judge was letting him talk, and then the room went black. And then I have read enough. I read those 26 volumes of the Warren Commission over and over, and every time they go off the record or change the subject, this is noted. And when he said too much, when the judge was too lenient, that ended the whole tone of the case, and he couldn't admit any more before the jury. Now we'll get back to the tooth incident and then back to the book Search for Justice. After his tooth was pulled and pieces splintered with the pliers, and he was, bleeding in shock, then he walks down the hall, and the guards take him, assault him, beat him, take the cotton out of his bleeding mouth, and break another tooth on the way back to his cell. That's in Soledad. This can be done.
The prison hasn't answered.
The prison watched him being beat up. I'll give you the date that they
has the prison... Has this has been brought up in court?
This is brought up in court. And
what has been the prison's reaction?
No, you mean
has anyone from the courts asked whether this has been done?
Should I tell you what happened in the court as he's telling about being the second tooth broken, as he's bleeding?
Well, somebody must have said that this isn't true, that Pindell is lying.
No, this has not been challenged. He's not lying, and he wants his dental records, and his defense attorney won't even bring them in to prove that he's right. And while he's telling about being up, he's talking, and he's looking around to the jury, and he's saying, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, let the record show that the sixth man in the jury is asleep. While he's telling about pulling his tooth with a plier, because they say let the dog suffer, let the pig suffer, and they call him baboon and nigger, and let him have it, and pull it without anesthetic. He points to juror number 6 who's asleep at that particular moment in his testimony. No, this is what was happening. That's just a fraction. This is a fraction of what happened. This Search for Justice says the lawyer's theory is simply that he could go back for an appeal. And the judge has said 10 times in 2 days, well, you can have an appeal. He sat there yesterday with the jury out of the room, and the judge made him give a lot more evidence of things he had, and then he kept throwing them out one by one. The jury couldn't see him. Well, let the record show you can have appeal. Pindell doesn't need an appeal. He could be proved innocent now. He'll be dead before the next appeal comes. So the judge is throwing this along and not letting the jury see any information that would prove his innocence. So he'll obviously have a new trial, but then he won't be alive. And I compared this in a book about Nazi Germany, how they killed 400 different types of political assassinations, and those were people that were catching on to the system of fascism. And they terrorized other people by lengthening the court system and letting them see what happens to them. This was a technique used in Nazi Germany, and this is what they would use on Pinell. He has to have another trial, but they'll close it this week. They're rushing through it today and tomorrow, Thursday and Friday. It'll probably be over by Saturday. I'm on record, on this tape. It'll go to New York, wherever my voice can be heard, or in the printed word. This was no trial. I know the other trials weren't either, of Manson, Sirhan, Frazier, not James Ray. And this one is easy because it's a 2-week proof that there was no trial and evidence of innocence. The Search for Justice says the inquisitorial system assumes that the judge will be a seeker of truth and will not develop a policeman complex or see his role as a paid public official who needs to curb or control crime. I'll repeat that, and I'll tell you about the judge out there yesterday. The inquisitorial system assumes the judge will be a seeker of truth and will not develop a policeman complex or seek his role as a paid public official who has to curb or control crime. End quotes. I saw Judge Machado yesterday. I saw Hugo Pinell read a list of 30 people, eyewitnesses on the tier, who said he did not kill McCarthy, a guard at Fort Ord. He's accused of killing a guard at Fort Ord. The medical reports of how McCarthy died have been taken from Fort Ord Hospital. He was a guard, not at Fort Ord, at Soledad. Yeah. He died at Fort Ord. He was a guard at Soledad. And I'm going to read the testimony where Pinell was told, if you write a letter saying that George Jackson was involved in a murder in the prison system, you will be out on parole. And if you don't, we'll break you and we'll pin a rap on you and we'll keep you in for life. And they even said that they could kill a guard or anybody and pin it on him. This came out in the testimony. Now, a guard died by the name of McCarthy, and at the time that he was stabbed, he was taken to a hospital in Salinas, and he requested to go to Fort Ord, and he was conscious, and he was taken to Fort Ord. And he was in the emergency room there, and he passed away. And the medical records of how he died are not available. They're gone from Fort Ord. They're completely missing from this whole case. And this is identical to my other, like the car of John Kennedy being destroyed. The prosecution, the defense, nobody has a record of what happened to McCarthy, the nature of his wounds or how he died at Fort Ord. But there are men, and I'm going to list them, that Pinell asked to be called as material witnesses to prove his innocence. And his defense attorney, appointed by the district attorney's office in Salinas, would not call these people. His defense attorney will not call these people. I went up during the interview.
Why won't he call them?
I went up to him. This is why he called KLRB, or had his wife call, or another defense attorney's wife, third person, and I asked him about that yesterday. That's kind of a really chicken kind of thing to do. I went to him in the foyer, and I said, Mr. Tucker, why won't you call the people that Pinell wants? He said, because I won't. I said, but you could prove his innocence. He said, well, wait till you hear my summation. And he said, I will give you a summation. Because on the stand, Hugo Pinell accused his defense attorney, public defender, appointed by the district attorney's office, of being part of a conspiracy against him. So I said, why won't you call these people in? He said, well, wait till you hear my summary tomorrow or the next day. And I said, summary? This case has only started. I mean, you've got a list of witnesses here. He wouldn't call him. He was going to give a summary. I said, then you have to be part of this conspiracy that he's talking about, accusing him on the stand, because you won't call the people and it would prove his innocence. He said, well, then say what you want. That's the way I do it. He says, I've been to law school, and this is the way I do it. And I said, well, I just can't believe it. I really can't believe it. So yesterday, a witness came in court by the name of Raymond Marcus, and I have a list here of the people that have been put in the hole who wanted to testify or would. For on behalf of Bunnell. So Raymond Marcus was brought into court yesterday. He had heavy chains around his ankles. His arms were so tight, that there was no circulation hardly in his wrists. He had chains around his shoulders, and then he had them around his neck. And they were very tight around his neck. They were choking him. And he was the man who could speak up. Pinnell couldn't have the other 30 people he wanted, but Raymond Marcus was brought in. And Raymond Marcus began to talk about how, suggesting that Pinnell was innocent. He said, "Pardon me, Your Honor, I can't talk with these chains on my neck." And the judge says, "Do you want to continue or get out as a witness?" And he says, "Well, could you?" There were 4 armed guards in back of him. There were 4 on the side. The room had 8 in the back of the room. The FBI men sit there every third seat, and they line up the back of the row. The halls are filled with armed people. This man is handcuffed at a table, chains on his body to a chair. His legs are chained, and he can't talk. But if you remove the throat chain, he'd give his testimony. And the judge said, either speak now, speak up now, or you will not be used as a witness. And he said, "Pardon me, couldn't you just remove my throat? He is not used to court proceedings." He said, "I'm choking. I can't talk. The air isn't coming." The judge says, "Remove Marcus from the room. He can't be used as a witness in defense of Pinnell." Well, with that, Marcus took his arms and snapped his handcuffs open. He was thoroughly chained in every way, and that's when the guards jumped on and pulled his hair out, and that's when the 40 officers came in. They wanted to bring the National Guards. The police came. That's when the men were pinned down to the floor in their chairs, the chains rattling. They were screaming. We didn't know how they were brutalized, and the whole law enforcement team was jumping on them. There were, like 40 people on the other side of the bar in court, and 40 men, at least, on these 2 men who were moaning and groaning.
Okay, we'll continue with more of Dialogue Assassination after we identify the station. This is KLRB, Carmel, Stereo 101.7, serving you 24 hours a day.
The reason I sent the telegram to Washington was I really thought that Raymond Marcus could be killed, in that evening or in the near future, and Hugo Pinnell would be killed, and the guards won't kill him. They won't beat him. They said they would, but they'll get a man and offer him parole, and they'll say there was a fight between the blacks and whites. And I want on the record that if either of these men are killed, that the whole California justice system is responsible for their murders, and specifically the judicial system, Raymond Pecunier and Evel Younger, must stand. They have no public immunity like Mr. Kissinger hides behind, or people in the White House. They have to stand for what is happening in these cases, and I want it public now that if any guard or anyone at Soledad kills these men or damages them first anymore, I want the record straight who's doing it. I'm going now to just go to some notes I took directly from the trial, from the words of Hugo Pinnell. I think you'll understand what's happening. First, I'm going to read that letter Robert Kastenmeier wrote from the subcommittee number 3. That's the gentleman I sent the wire to.
Kastenmeier is what? Is he a staff member?
No, he's a member of the House of Representatives.
Okay. He's one of the San Quentin Six.
He's one of the San Quentin Six, and this goes along with their intention just to frame him. He just happened to be there. He wasn't part of a conspiracy at all. He was there for medical examinations, and he was at the prison at the time.
Did he ever get those medical examinations?
Well, let me tell you what happened about this medical examination. He was so badly clubbed, and I don't think he ever got complete examinations. He couldn't. But this is how he describes it. These are his words I took from the trial this week in Salinas. He was clubbed on the head. And after the shootout, they took all the men in the prison, and wanted to question them, interrogate them, what was happening. He was clubbed on the head, even though he had just been at the prison for the purpose of examinations. He was completely naked. The men were completely naked, and their hands were chained behind their backs, and the handcuffs were so tight, he said the circulation was cut off. Their ankles were shackled, and their hands were behind their back, and they were naked, and they were thrown outside in the yard for about 4 hours, where he was beaten up continuously and clubbed. And then he was taken back to a place called the Fort Post to be asked about the incident of the shootout that took place that August. They busted my head. They chained me on the grass for no reason at all. And the lieutenant in charge of questioning said, well, let's take that dog back on the grass, because they wanted me to waive certain rights. They took me in for questioning. He said I wouldn't waive them. So they said, let's take that dog back on the grass, and they dumped me there. Then Raymond Precunier, the head of Department of Corrections, was in a room where they called him back in, and they said, now it's your turn. He was about the 9th or 10th to be interrogated, and they brought him into a room. Precunier was there observing. The Attorney General, Everett Youngler, was there observing. Ray Parks of San Quentin, the warden at San Quentin, was there observing, and he said, other people I don't know, and they were watching the questioning of Pinnell. Now, this is the same Precunier that the House of Representatives is asking what happened. They had a gun pointed at my head, and they said that if I groaned any time, my head would be blown off just in the same manner as George Jackson's. They buried my head when I was outside in the grass, and I could hardly breathe. They told me not to remove any part of my body, and I remained still. And then back at the adjustment center, when they brought me in, bring Pinnell in, there was Mr. Jacobs, the associate superintendent, who was in civilian clothes, Precunier, Parks. The officers grabbed me into the adjustment center. They immediately hit me, and they stabbed me in my leg. And I still have the scar. He showed he had socks on and chains yesterday, his left leg. He has a scar where they stabbed him in his leg in the presence of Younger, Precunier, and Parks. And they kicked me, and they punched me in the face. And they then finally put me on a chair, and they grabbed my hair, and they jerked my head back, and they said, we're going to give you a haircut. And Jacobs said, he's the adjustment center, works out there, said, why don't we just kill him now? And Parks spat at my face. He's chained, his hands and feet, shaving his hair in all different zigzag directions, probably because the hair was a symbol of the black unity, you know, and it wasn't that long, but they were going to chop it all up. He said like a patchwork thing into little pieces up and down and lanes, you know, to make it all look silly. And Jacob said, why don't we kill him now? And Parks said, no, this is just the beginning of him. We're going to leave him as an example for all those revolutionaries and political inmates and those who don't believe in our system. And he'll become the tool and the object. He's more beneficial if he's alive so that we can break his spirit to show the others. And Parks said, well, I could kill you right now, but I won't. Pinnell said, go ahead and kill me. And Parks said, I won't kill you now. The inmates at the adjustment center will just have to see how we can use a person as an example and break their spirit.
Okay, those are all charges that Pinnell makes, but he's got no way to back them up. Nobody else is going to admit.
He can't
if that were true, no one else is going to say that. That's his word against theirs.
He has asked the defense attorney to call Precunier. I have a list of people. He has asked, here's a list of the people that he's asked to come to this trial, to say under oath whether this happened or not. He wants Congress.
Do you think under oath it would make any difference?
Well, I think they should.
Just because they're under oath that they would admit something like that if it were true?
Well, I think there were other witnesses and guards in the room, and these men through perjury. See, if you want to get a man out of Congress or a hardened man, say in the gang wars and so forth, you've gone through tax or perjury. You never got him on the crime. And you could call Precunier or Younger. You could call in Parks and ask them if this happened, if this is the way they interrogate. And if they say no and other witnesses say yes, or if you have recordings or minutes of these things, these men should be removed from office. You know, he asked to have Congressman Dellums. He had written him a letter about this. He asked Bobby Soto as a witness, an eyewitness of the alleged killing of McCarthy, who was in cell 134, wouldn't come. He wanted Dr. Frank Rundell, his psychiatrist. He wanted inmate Bateras from cell 136, an eyewitness. He asked for James Park, the warden of San Quentin. He asked for Mr. Fitzharris from Sacramento. He asked for the head administrator of South Facility. He asked for Mr. Bailey to give the dental plates and x-rays to prove about how his teeth were handled. Officer Tucker and Owing. I have a list of 30 people, but the public defender won't call them. See, so you can say, well, this is hearsay. If he were defending him, you see, the district attorney's office that's prosecuting is defending. And Mr. Tucker won't invite these people in. So the judge can say, now you take it. He let him talk for 5 hours and 2 days. He says to the jury, now you realize that this is all hearsay, you know, as testimony. And so Pinnell says, but I want it documented. Like you say, I want these witnesses here to get in the record, whether it is or not. And the public defender refuses to call them. And a man can't call anybody to his own defense. And the lawyer that he wants for the case, Ed Caldwell, was removed from the case. He couldn't have him. When the DA's office in Salinas found out that Caldwell was going to take the case, he wouldn't let him take it. the lawyer that he wanted, just like James Ray couldn't have Haynes as his lawyer, or Ruby couldn't have Howard.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm bringing up. That's the only reason I bring up the fact that this is Pinnell's word against other people's word. Do you think that the only hope that Pinnell has is to try to get numerous witnesses who might have seen these things happening to not collaborate each other's stories?
Oh, we'll say that again.
Well, in other words, so that there'd be inconsistencies among all these people.
I don't think there'd be any inconsistencies in any of the witnesses that he would call in. They are dying and willing to hold to their story. They are in holes now in those strip cells that you were talking about. They are holding to the truth, and they won't be badgered because their life is on the line, and they can't be bought or sold, and they're holding to the truth. And I know it's the truth because they're holding on at such a heavy price with the whippings and isolations that they're taking.
Strip cells which Soledad denies exist.
Oh, they're in there right now.
Yeah. But I followed that up as a news story when Pinnell passed a note to his mother several days ago during the trial, saying that some of the witnesses that he wanted to have called were being held in strip cells, and they were on a hunger strike for so many days. And so I checked that out, and Soledad called back and said no, there was no such thing as strip cells. They had phased those out, and that these men, several of the men that I named as potential witnesses for Pinnell, I named as being participating in this hunger strike, he said were moved to end housing, which I found out later that end housing is what the prisoners call strip cells.
Yeah.
And strip cells are smaller than average cells with a raised concrete platform to be used as a bed, and until very recently not even a toilet. There was just a hole in the side.
And it's dark. Pinnell has been in one of those, and he said, well, I'm having a trial. I have to have light. I'm on court. I was in a strip cell this week with no light, no bed, no nothing. He says, I go to court every day, and I want to work with my lawyer. Get the name of the man you talked to out there and write it down.
George Baker.
Okay, because, see, the news coverage this week in the Monterey Herald has an article about 2 inches long that Pinnell is talking on his own behalf, and it says there's electric power blackout, which we'll go into, and then it says his monologue consumed 5 hours. I'm reading you what his monologue is. Our local paper doesn't even tell. Now, I'm going to rush on now to finish the thing what happened in San Quentin in front of Pecunier and Neville Younger, and then tell you what happened down at Soledad, where they wanted him to frame George Jackson, and this was the beginning of the conspiracy against Pinnell. He was told, they said, we could kill you right now, the prison official said, Mr. Parks. And he said, go ahead and kill me. And they said, no, we won't kill you. We'll use you as an example for the other inmates to see how you break their spirits. He said, I was taken upstairs, brutalized again, dragged with chains on his shoulders and legs and told crawl, dog, and crawl to his cell. And the 1 minute that Marcus was on the stand yesterday, he was telling that if it weren't for the men on death row and some of the people, the prisoners, Pinnell wouldn't be alive now. They just let him bleeding hours and hours at a time, week after week. I mentioned last week he's the most brutalized prisoner in the California prison system. And you were kind of shocked. Remember, we talked about that. He said, when they finally put me in my cell, Procunier of the Department of Corrections was present at the time. He refused to do anything. He didn't say a word. He was part of the conspiracy. He knew I was from Monterey County, and I was only in San Quentin for medical tests to appear at the UCLA Medical Center 2 days later.
UC San Francisco.
UC Medical Center San Francisco, yeah. He says that same night, after he was brutalized on the lawn and left to bleed and beat up and clubbed and his legs stabbed, the same night, between 8:30 and 9, Lieutenant Nelson came by with a gun to my cell. He didn't point it to me. He just held it at his side and said I would never leave San Quentin alive. He spit on my face, just like Parks did. He said we would all be killed. I spit back, and he said told me he would wait for the moment. They had special plans for me. He came again and said, we will blow your brains out. I don't have to wait for orders for your specific date or for your death. I can kill you tonight or any night or wherever you may be.
Again, it's his word against theirs, though. There's no way to back this up.
Well, if he can,
it is hearsay.
This is Pinnell's word of what happened. He has asked the defense attorney for the public defender to call these people to back up what he's saying, and they refuse to do it. Now, how do you handle a case like that? He is willing to have these people come in. He is begging for them. He's accusing the public defender of a conspiracy to keep him down because they won't allow him to back up his statements. See, the judge keeps saying this is hearsay or you can have an appeal. Now, I'm going into what happened in Soledad. in 1970. This preceded the incident of August up at in 71 at San Quentin. In January the 17th, 1970, I was in my cell. I'm reading Hugo Pinnell's words. And I was approached by Sergeant Madden and Mr. Fritz. And I'm using those names because those men could be called in on the stand and either say true or false and get perjury or tell the truth. You see, I was approached by Sergeant Madden and Mr. Fritz. And I was asked if I knew anyone by the name of George Jackson. And they said Jackson was on the other side of the prison. Would I like permission to see him? And I said, why are you doing this? Isn't this against regulations? And they said, well, he may be going to main line again, and you like him, and you can see him. And at that time, George Jackson was down in that strip cell, 123, numbered 123. So they chained me down, they did a skin search, and they took me to the other side of the jail, and Sergeant Maddox and these other officers went with me. And I saw George lying on the floor, and I gave him greetings, and he returned them. We shook hands and smiled, and I said to him, did you have a date, meaning to get out soon? And he said no. And after a brief talk, we parted, and I was led to the other side, and I was put in my cell for a few minutes. And an hour later, I was told to come out, and they would take me to the Sally Port, and I was going to meet a committee review. They were going to have
What's the Sally Port?
Well, that's a place outside of the cells, evidently, a railing or a meeting place that's larger than the alley where the cells are. Sally Port must be like an entrance out there where they congregate. I was taking the Sally Port, and they said, we're going to have a committee review with you. And he said, testified it wasn't a committee review. And inside, they took him to Captain Moody.
What's a committee review supposed to be?
Well, to review whether you'll be out on parole soon or whether...
What's he due for parole?
Well, he's been in, since 1965 on a rate, 3 years to life. He would be due for parole if he behaved.
He was eligible for parole.
At any time he had served more than his 3 years. If they wanted him to get out, yes, he could have gotten out. And I'm looking for the background of Moody. We'll go into that. Okay, Captain Moody takes him in. Moody says we'll have a committee review. Captain Moody was in civilian clothes. Captain Moody now works for the Public Defender's Office and also the Justice Department of the state of California. Captain Moody said to him, the Lieutenant Maddox was in uniform, and there was another man there who was not tall. He was 5'7". He was 5'9", dirty blonde, civilian clothes. The defense should know who the other man was. The attorney should ask Moody and Maddox, the public defender, who this man was, because in all of these political conspiracies and assassinations, I wonder if they're tied into the Central Intelligence Agency like the L.A. Police Department is in Philadelphia. There's always this unidentified person in plain clothes who shouldn't be in the prison, who's always with him when he's brutalized, and the other man took notes. The other man was there, and he told me to sit down, and they offered me coffee, and they offered me cigarettes, and I refused both. And Moody said to me, in quotes, that he was a public defender, and at that time, he said, he said, he was talking at that time, he said, and I didn't say anything because I know Moody very well from the prison system. And he said he had an investigator with him. This was the plainclothes man, and Moody did the talking. And then Sergeant Maddox
Moody worked for the prison.
He said he was a public defender. He worked for the prison at the time.
But Pinnell says that he identified himself as a public defender.
And now that's important. That's one of the most important parts of the case, that he
If Moody knew that Pinnell knew him, why would he identify himself as a public defender?
Well, because Pinnell has no access to the media or outside. I'll tell you why when you read. I'm going to tell you now what he said, and then you'll see why he did it. He said Captain Moody was in civilian clothes, but he identified himself as a public defender and said he had an investigator with him. And Sergeant Maddox said, Pinnell, you just got through talking with Jackson, didn't you? And he said, yes. He said, you face charges soon in Sacramento, right? He says, that's right. And he says, we could do it for you. We'll fix it for you. And they offered to fix the charges and get Pinnell out of prison now. We'll fix it for you. He says, if you do what we tell you, we'll get you out. But if you don't, you'll never get home again. If you do, you'll get to the main line. That means they were in segregated, isolated wings. The main line is the main body of the prison system. And if you tell us that during your conversation with George Jackson, he admitted committing a crime, we'll get you to the main line. We have the juice, meaning the context. We could change all of your charges. We could change it. And Pinnell said to Maddox, you are a fool. You picked the wrong person. I will not lie about George Jackson or anybody else. And Maddox said, Pinnell, you are a fool. You could go to the main line and later get your charges dropped. Now, this is in the public record, Phil. You'll be able to purchase it. I'll get it. I'm not making this up. I said I will get the...
But again, it's hearsay, right?
It's also in the testimony now that he was not allowed, the public record, that he couldn't get these men into court, that the public defender wouldn't allow. And that's in the record. Pinnell kept bringing it out.
But these are Pinnell's charges.
These are Pinnell's charges, but the public defender won't allow him to show to the jury that it happened. See? He said, Maddox said, I'll get your charges dropped anyway. And I said, he says, I'll get your charges dropped. And Pinnell says, well, I'll get mine anyway dropped, because he knows it was time to come out and he hadn't done anything wrong. And he said, I don't like being segregated here. I want to be at the main line. I function better among everybody. And Moody listened, and the plainclothes man took notes, and Maddox did the talking. And he said, don't you consider yourself as important as George Jackson? And Pinnell said, I consider Jackson something very special to me. He's the only man inside or outside our prison who could teach me anything. And I love the man. And there's no competition between us because we want the same objective and we have progressive ideals.
Now, I don't understand. Did Pinnell know Jackson outside of that one conversation that had been set up?
They had been...
Pinnell says was set up?
Well, they had been together at various times in the prison system, and he through... I don't know how much time they had in the yard together, but there was time that he got to know Jackson. Yes, they were friends, and they shared reading time and books. He had a whole list of books in his cell, and he knew Jackson, and he liked Jackson. But George Jackson spent 6 or 8 years in solitary confinement in a hole, and there wasn't much time. But everyone knew about George Jackson in Soledad, and they loved George Jackson. And he said, he's the only person inside of the prison that could teach me anything. And I would never do what you said. And they said, well, this is a foolish move on your part because you could be going home. And by not signing a paper against George Jackson, putting your name to it, you are closing every avenue you'll ever have to go home. And Pinnell said, you already told me I would never go home. And Maddox said, but we have the juice to drop those charges. We manipulate in our own fashion, and your charges will be dropped. Now, I think Maddox should have been called as a witness in this case, because Pinnell has claimed there was a conspiracy against him. And Maddox said, we will put you, if you obey, on the main line, and you put in a strong statement and a written statement about George Jackson, and I'll do everything in my power to set you up. And he went on to say, you were lucky enough not to be here on the 13th. That was the killing out in the yard where Nolan and the other 3 black fellows were killed out in the yard. And he said, you were lucky not to be here on the 13th, because at that time he was up at San Quentin going back and forth. He said, or you would have been killed along with Nolan. And Maddox said, we'll tell you from now on you can expect death every angle possible, whether you're awake or asleep. Tell us Jackson committed a crime and you go home. And if you don't tell us, you'll be dead. And I told Maddox then I would accept his coffee. I stood up and said, I will accept your coffee. And I stood up and I threw it in his face. And I told him, you are not bargaining with any fool, Mr. Maddox. I am a defendant in my case in Sacramento, but that does not mean I am stupid. And Maddox said, that coffee is hot, Pinnell, but it's going to be hotter for you. At that moment, at 11:15, the lights went out in the court.
That's when during Pinnell's testimony.
During Pinnell's testimony, the lights went out in court. Now, a lot of people are not as familiar with the technique that this system uses. I have studied in the past 9 years. The lights went out. Then they went on, and when they went out, I said to the people around me, this case will end now. This is the end of the trial of Hugo Pinnell. Because what happens is this, Louis Tackwood, the agent provocateur that we mentioned in L.A., said, when he surfaced and said he was a provocateur for 10 years, the LA Police Department said that he was wired with a listening device in his home or when he was up at the Berkeley City Council or on the streets, that when he talked to a person, that conversation went directly to the police department in LA, and they could hear the conversations. He didn't have to get to a phone and tell them what happened. What he said was a radio that went right to the police department. And what is said in that courtroom was going to Sacramento. I know it went outside the call and went to Sacramento because this involves the position, the prestige, the power of Ebel Younger, Pecunier, and Parks. And the judge up to this point for 2 days had allowed Pinnell, he had no public defender, so the judge did say to him, tell us in your own words why you think there was a conspiracy against you. And I wrote as fast as I could, as I say, 50 pages. I was writing like mad what he was saying. And the judge was the most lenient in that particular moment to let Pinnell, because a public defender wouldn't allow someone to come in. But at the same time, the judge kept saying to the jury, remember, this is hearsay, remember, it's hearsay, or I want it on the record that if he has an appeal, I've been fair. Well, what he's doing by allowing appeal and not forcing the public defender to be fired like Pinnell wants is that he's sending the boy back to jail where he'll be killed. Or the man who came in, Marquez, could be killed, just while we're talking this week or the next month or half a year. So the judge wants the record that he's fair, but he won't let it be on the record to be proven by any of the witnesses coming in, and the electorate goes out. We take a break till 1:30, and the judge says, okay, Pinnell, go back and talk, and I want you to know all the time he's in terrible pain and beaten up and so forth. He comes back to talk, and just when he is going some more into his conspiracy thing, the prosecution changes the subject, like with the Warren Commission hearings, changes the subject. Pinnell has an envelope more to prove of conspiracy against him. These are just 2 instances I talked about. There's 20 more we could do. He can't finish. The prosecution changes the subject. They bring in other witnesses. The public defender won't get back to Pinnell. They send the jury out of the room. Everything to prove his defense is thrown out, and the court it'll be interesting to see how this winds up if he ever does get an extension of this for the next week and a new defender. He has no defender during this week. The public defender walked out, and the jury didn't know he was there. In summary, the case of Hugo Pinnell must be told across this nation. In Washington, it falls on the California penal system. They're incremental. This man has been threatened with death so many times. He's putting his life on the line to tell you what's happening in this state, and I want you all to write letters to Washington. If you can't do anything else, everyone who heard this show, write to Washington and say, please investigate the entire trial of Hugo Pinnell. We do not want another trial. This trial should continue now, right now, and prove his innocence.
Dialogue Assassination with political research specialist Mae Brussell. I'm Phil